So, in short, the enemy of a republic would be empire and all the many components or facets of empire, which we've discussed before. They're oligarchy, usury, abstraction. And the framers were well aware of all three of these things. And that's what they purported to safeguard themselves from by creating the structure of government called a republic. And the most important key, this is the nut that had to be cracked in order to create this republic. It had to be geographically small. That is by definition what a republic is. And this had come down through the ages, but was especially stressed by Baron Montesquieu in 1748 in his Spirit of the Laws. And Montesquieu had famously looked at all forms of government to his mind that had ever existed, and his assessment that the freest people had the least government, the least influence of government upon the individual liberties of the people, and it had been geographically small. So what did we say oligarchy is? Oligarchies are small groups of people from prominent families who pass on their influence. Now, we've already suggested that throughout America, we looked at a number of thinkers. We found that from the beginning, from the framing, we can track just that's existed and exerted power in American political history. A small number of families that exert inordinate influence upon the affairs of others. They pass their influence along, and it's generally done for their own good before the good of others. That's the oligarchical form of government. We talked about the iron law of oligarchy, and I challenged anybody to look at that information and refute it. It's from the book Robert Michael's Political Parties, 1911. He establishes the iron law of oligarchy. He said, any form of government that tries to put the hands of power into the people, in other words, be a democratic form of government based upon consent or the actual participation of individuals on the political project, will inevitably revert to essentially an oligarchical form of government. He says basically governments by the people are impossible. So he's writing this in 1911, and 100 years before, the framers of this country were very aware, according to the idea of Plato, democracies always degenerated into a form of oligarchy. You had oligarchies, you had democracies, and it was the worst form because essentially Plato and all the great thinkers of the ages understood essentially it was just a face. It was a cutout in which oligarchy continued to operate. And so this is what this Republican form of government, can you get the democracy without the influence of the oligarchical class in place? And so that's what was going on in the United States. The Declaration of Independence was issued in 1776, and there we find 13 separate republics. Each of them had their own army. Each of them had their own constitution. Each of them had their own currency. Each of them had their own trade policy. Each of them had their own governors or presidents. There were 13 separate nation states. The argument for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution was the pitting, it's this great pitting of ideas between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the Hamiltonian class and the Jeffersonian class. And I have suggested that there's a bit of controlled opposition here, but these larger ideas are still being debated on the world stage. And Hamilton, of course, from the get-go, he's very pretty much transparent that he's working for the aristocratic families out of the city of London. However, at the same time, he's all about establishing a sort of commercial empire here in the United States, but he wants it to keep, according to Hamilton, a very close associations with the crown. And the Anti-Federalists are going to argue, in short, that according to Montesquieu, to truly safeguard the influence of oligarchy, abstraction, usury, and pernicious influence upon the liberties of people, you're going to have a republican form of government. According to Montesquieu, 1748, Spirit of the Laws, it was generally accepted across the board from all the thinkers of the age, including Voltaire, Rousseau, that this had to be a small form of government. So the Federalist plan to kind of hook everybody together on this side of the earth into one political arrangement was basically perceived by them as creating a new empire. An empire would invite in usury, foreign influence, abstraction, and the leading oligarchical classes, because it would be large, distant, the same way that the British Empire was distant from the colonies. Maine would be distant from Georgia, and so forth. Undue influences are easy to sneak in there, and they recognized that. It seemed to the anti-federalists, largely in the South, that this was basically an underhanded plot to reintroduce empire here and invite the influences of London back upon the affairs of the colonists. So that was the argument. And what we learn in political science is the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. They were both arguing for what would give the greatest liberty to the individual, but from two different angles. But Federalist number 10, of all of the Federalist papers written that argue for or against this new form of government, this United States of America, Federalist number 10 is the question: can individuals still be free?